They thought they were confiscating a laptop and a badge. What they actually dismissed was a signature tied to the company's most valuable clause, one buried in NDA Section 9, waiting for someone important enough to read it aloud. The conference room smelled like overbrewed coffee and quiet panic. Beige walls, a framed mission statement about integrity and innovation, and a long glass table that reflected every nervous twitch like a mirror no one asked for. HR sat across from me with a folder so thin it looked harmless. Thin folders are never harmless. "Sign here. Taking company property is forbidden," she said, sliding the paper forward as if it were a napkin at lunch instead of a verdict. Her voice was polished, almost gentle, the kind of tone people use when they're sure they're right, or when they're sure you're too small to matter. I glanced at the header. Termination for cause. Underneath, a neat paragraph about proprietary materials, confidential files, and immediate revocation of access. The words company property were bolded, as if bold font made them braver. For a second, something fragile fluttered inside me. 3 years of late nights, 3 years of building the licensing framework that now lived in spreadsheets, contracts, and, most importantly, in one particular clause. NDA Section 9. The clause everyone skimmed, the clause I had insisted on writing myself. "Is there a problem?" HR asked, fingers steepled. Across the glass wall, I could see my reflection layered over the open office. Rows of identical desks, potted plants that were always slightly dying, monitors glowing like silent witnesses. A few colleagues pretended not to look. No one wanted to be seen watching someone fall. "No," I said calmly. "No problem," I signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Ink scratched across the paper with a quiet finality. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind them that the so-called company property they accused me of taking was a template draft I had authored before I was even on payroll. I didn't point out that intellectual ownership and access rights were not the same thing. Instead, I signed and slid the paper back. A flicker crossed HR's face. Relief? Satisfaction? Maybe she had expected tears or resistance. What she got was stillness. That unsettled her more. "You'll receive a confirmation email. IT has already disabled your credentials," she added, gathering the pages like a dealer sweeping cards off a table. Of course they had. They always move fast when they think they're protecting something valuable. They just never checked who actually holds the key. I packed my desk under the fluorescent hum that makes everything look slightly unreal. My mug? A notebook with tabs sticking out like bookmarks in a story that hadn't finished. The small framed quote my father once gave me. "Paper remembers." He was a contracts attorney. He taught me that signatures are quiet weapons, that rights aren't about who shouts loudest, but who writes carefully enough. When I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. Internal Slack notification. My access hadn't fully died yet. Channel, #investor-review, a single message pinned at the top. Reminder, tomorrow 9 a.m., investor review, final due diligence, NDA compliance confirmation required. My lips curved before I could stop them. Investor review. They had spent weeks polishing presentations, tweaking forecasts, rehearsing growth projections in front of bathroom mirrors. The CEO had practiced his vision speech so many times he could probably deliver it in his sleep. And somewhere inside that mountain of documents, in a folder labeled Legal Final, sat the NDA, with Section 9 intact, or so they believed. The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic sigh. As I descended, I felt something shift inside me, not revenge, not anger exactly, but a strange clarity. They had fired me for taking company property. But the clause that defined licensing rights, future royalties, derivative usage, third-party transfers, was never company property. It was conditional on my continued employment. That detail had seemed excessive when I first drafted it. Overprotective, the CFO had called it with a laugh. We trust our team. Trust is lovely. Contracts are safer. Outside, the evening air carried the smell of rain and car exhaust. The city lights blinked on one by one like cautious witnesses. I stood on the sidewalk longer than necessary, watching my reflection fade in the building's glass facade. They thought they had cleaned house before the big show. What they had actually done was alter the foundation hours before inspection. My phone buzzed again, this time a private message from Daniel in legal. Hey, off the record, are you sure about leaving like this? I stared at the screen. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. I didn't leave, I replied. They terminated the rights holder. 3 dots pulsed on his end. Then nothing. Rain began to fall, slow, deliberate drops that darkened the pavement. I walked away without looking back, not because I was defeated, but because I knew something they didn't. Tomorrow morning, someone important would read NDA Section 9 aloud, and when they did, the room would go very, very quiet. If you think this was just about a badge and a laptop, you're already underestimating the clause. Morning arrived dressed in glass and steel. At 8:57 a.m., sunlight spilled across the executive conference room, sharp and unforgiving, illuminating every polished surface as if the building itself wanted to look impressive. The long oak table gleamed. Bottled water stood in symmetrical rows. A projection screen glowed with the title slide, Investor Review, Final Compliance Confirmation. No one noticed the empty chair at the far end. They noticed everything else. The CEO adjusted his cufflinks. The CFO tapped through spreadsheets one last time. HR sat slightly back, arms crossed in the composed posture of someone who believes a problem has already been solved. After all, the rights issue had been handled yesterday. Handled cleanly. At exactly 9:03, the investor entered. He wasn't loud. That was the first thing people always misunderstood. Real leverage rarely announces itself. He carried a slim leather portfolio and a pen that probably cost more than most monthly rents. His eyes were steady, curious, not hostile. Yet, "Good morning," he said, taking his seat. "Let's begin with compliance. I prefer to read the ND as myself." A flicker crossed the CFO's face. Just a second. Then a rehearsed smile. "Of course. Everything is standard." Standard. The document was passed across the table like a ceremonial object. Pages turned, the room settled into the brittle quiet of people waiting for approval. The investor read without rushing. He underlined a sentence, nodded once, turned another page. Then his pen paused. "Section 9, he said. The CEO leaned forward slightly. "Yes, licensing and derivative rights, standard protective clause." "Standard?" the investor repeated, voice still calm. Silence shifted in the room, almost physical. He read aloud. "All proprietary licensing frameworks, derivative models, and third-party assignable structures developed under this agreement remain conditionally assigned to the company, contingent upon the continued employment and active authorization of the originating signatory." His eyes lifted. "Who is the originating signatory?" The CFO swallowed. "That would be, was, our head of licensing." "Was?" The word landed softly. Too softly. The CEO cleared his throat. "We terminated her yesterday. There were concerns regarding company property." The investor blinked once. "You fired the rights holder?" The air thinned. HR straightened. "The clause transfers automatically to the company upon termination." "That's implied." The investor turned the page back, slowly, precisely. It is not implied, he said. It is explicitly conditional. He tapped the line with his pen. Contingent upon continued employment. The CEO's rehearsed composure cracked, just a hairline fracture. Our legal team approved this language. Did they? The investor's tone remained neutral, but something colder threaded through it. Because what I'm reading suggests that the assignable framework, the core monetization structure you're presenting as scalable, is legally tethered to a person who no longer works here. A quiet ripple moved through the room, the kind that precedes panic. The CFO flipped open his laptop, fingers moving too quickly now. There must be a misinterpretation. There isn't, the investor replied. If the originating signatory is no longer employed, the conditional assignment dissolves, which means the rights revert. To her? HR whispered before she could stop herself. The investor didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Outside the glass walls, employees sensed the shift. Conversations slowed, heads lifted. Something was wrong. Inside, the CEO attempted control. This is a minor technicality. We can amend the agreement. After termination? The investor's eyebrows rose slightly. Retroactively. That word, retroactively, hung in the room like smoke. You're asking me to fund expansion based on intellectual property you may not currently hold. No one breathed. Have you informed your board? He added. The CEO hesitated. That hesitation said everything. The investor closed the NDA with deliberate care. I require clarification, he said. In writing, today? His chair moved back with a soft scrape against the floor. The sound was louder than it should have been. Until this is resolved, the investment is paused. Paused, not declined, not canceled. Paused. Which meant public disclosure would follow if mishandled. The room fractured into overlapping voices the moment he stepped out. The CFO whispered urgently to legal. HR's confidence evaporated into pale disbelief. The CEO stared at Section 9 as if it had personally betrayed him. But contracts do not betray. They remember. Across town, in a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and quiet ambition, I watched rain trace lines down the window. My phone vibrated. Daniel. They're reading it. Section 9. It's not going well. I took a slow sip of coffee. Steam rose between us like a curtain. I see, I said evenly. Another message came seconds later. He asked if we fired the rights holder. I didn't smile. Not fully, just enough to feel the balance shift back into alignment. I hope they answered honestly, I typed, 3 dots. They're scrambling. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in triumph, but in something steadier. Justice doesn't need noise, it just needs accuracy. Outside, traffic moved as usual. People hurried to meetings, unaware that in a glass tower a few blocks away, millions in projected growth now balanced on a single conditional sentence. And the day wasn't over. By noon, they would have to decide whether to call me. By afternoon, they would understand the cost of not doing so. If you think the hardest part was getting them to read Section 9, you haven't seen what happens when investors start asking for documentation. If you were in that conference room, what would you do next? Call her or try to fix it quietly? Tell me your move in the comments. By 12:14 p.m., my phone had missed 3 calls from an unknown number. I let the 4th one ring twice before answering. Hello? A pause, controlled breathing, executive-level restraint. This is Mark Caldwell, the CEO said, voice polished but thinner than yesterday. We need to discuss a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. I leaned back in my chair, watching sunlight spill across the cafe floor in fractured gold patterns. Outside, pedestrians moved briskly, unaware that a multi-million-dollar valuation had just discovered gravity. "I'm listening," I replied. Another pause. He wasn't used to being the one choosing words carefully. "There appears to be ambiguity in Section 9 of the NDA." "There isn't," I said gently. Silence again. This one longer. He cleared his throat. "The investor has temporarily paused funding pending clarification." Temporarily. Interesting choice? Clarification of what? I asked, though I knew. Of licensing control. The words cost him something. I traced the rim of my cup with one finger. Steam had faded now. The coffee was cooling, like the confidence in that glass tower. "You terminated my employment for alleged mishandling of company property," I said evenly. "That termination triggered the conditional clause." "You drafted that clause." "Yes." "And you didn't mention." "I mentioned it in legal review, twice." He exhaled, not angrily. Not yet. Just the sound of someone realizing the ground is not as solid as it seemed. "We need to resolve this quickly." Resolve. There it was, the shift from authority to necessity. Across the cafe, a barista dropped a spoon. The metallic clatter echoed for a split second, then settled. Small sounds feel louder when tension is tight. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. A rustle of papers on his end. Voices murmuring in the background, CFO probably. Maybe legal. HR wouldn't be speaking much today. "We'd like to discuss reinstating your employment and formalizing an amended assignment of rights." Reinstating. Yesterday I was escorted out. Today I was a structural requirement. "I see," I said softly. "You would return under revised terms, immediate effect." Revised terms. The phrase hovered between us like a contract waiting to be drafted. "And what about the termination for cause?" I asked. "That can be reclassified?" "Of course it can." I let the silence stretch. Negotiation is often about who fills it first. He did. "The investor requires confirmation by end of day. We are prepared to move quickly." Prepared. They weren't prepared yesterday. A wave of emotion moved through me. Not triumph, not anger, but something steadier. Validation. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need applause. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, voice calm and precise. "This isn't about returning to my desk." Another pause. "Then what is it about?" Outside, clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky so blue it almost looked artificial. "It's about correction," I replied. "A written acknowledgement that I did not misappropriate company property. A formal rescission of termination for cause, publicly documented." His breathing changed. "That could raise questions internally." "So does losing investor funding." A murmur on his end, someone whispering urgently. The word board carried faintly through the receiver. "We can issue a statement clarifying administrative error," he said. "Not administrative," I corrected. "Contractual." I could almost see the CFO flinch. "And compensation," I added, tone still level. "For reputational damage and emergency consulting on assignment transfer." The line went very quiet. There are moments when power doesn't shout, it recalibrates. "You're asking for a settlement," he said carefully. "I'm asking for accuracy." Another beat. "We'll need to draft terms." "I look forward to reviewing them." The call ended without resolution, but not without direction. My phone buzzed seconds later. Daniel again. They're in the war room, legal's rewriting half the termination file. I stood and walked toward the window. The city looked unchanged. Buses passed. Traffic lights blinked red to green. Somewhere above those streets, executives were learning that contracts do not bend to urgency. "They'll send something soon," he added. "I know," I replied. By 2:40 p.m., the draft arrived. Subject line, reinstatement and amendment proposal. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I watched the reflection of my own face in the darkened screen. Calm, focused, not vengeful, not reckless. They had tried to protect company property. Now they were negotiating for access. I opened the document slowly. The first paragraph already corrected the termination language. The second offered reinstatement as head of licensing. The third proposed a rights reassignment effective immediately upon signature. My eyes moved to the compensation section. Modest. Too modest. They still underestimated the cost of destabilized trust. My phone rang again. Mark, have you reviewed it? Yes. And? It's incomplete. A long exhale. What's missing? Investor assurance language, I said. A direct statement that rights continuity is secured through cooperative agreement, not conditional employment. Silence. You want to remove the conditional clause? No, I said quietly. I want to evolve it. That word landed. Evolve how? Convert it into a perpetual licensing structure in exchange for equity adjustment. This time, the silence carried calculation. Equity meant permanence. It meant I wasn't returning as an employee alone. It meant alignment. You're asking for shares, he said. I'm asking for alignment with the value I built. On the other end, muted voices rose, urgent, conflicted. The word precedent surfaced, so did valuation. Finally, he spoke. We'll need 30 minutes. You have 20, I replied gently. The investor asked for clarification by end of day. The call ended. I watched clouds move past the high-rise skyline. Somewhere in that building, executives were discovering that authority feels different when the clause holder is no longer silent. This was never about revenge. It was about documentation, and documentation was on my side. By 3:17 p.m., a new draft arrived. Revised language, equity allocation, formal rescission, public correction. They had moved faster than I expected, which meant something else was happening upstairs. If you think this negotiation is the climax, you haven't seen what investors do when they realize someone else reads contracts better than management. By 4:02 p.m., the revised document sat open on my screen like a chessboard mid-game. The language was cleaner now. The rescission of termination for cause was explicit. Administrative error had been replaced with misapplication of internal property policy. That phrasing alone would travel differently through hallways. It shifted blame from intent to process. Process is survivable. Intent is not. The equity clause sat near the bottom, carefully worded, almost shy. A percentage small enough not to alarm the board, large enough to anchor my role permanently to the licensing structure. They had learned something in the last 3 hours. Stability costs less than litigation. Still, something was missing. I zoomed in on the section referencing investor review. Company confirms continuity of proprietary licensing frameworks through cooperative agreement with originating signatory. Cooperative agreement, soft language, too soft. I picked up the phone before overthinking it. Mark answered on the first ring. We incorporated your requests. You did, I said, but investors don't fund softness. A beat. What do you want changed? Replace cooperative agreement with executed binding amendment and attach it as Appendix A. Paper shuffled on his end. Voices murmured. That level of specificity implies permanence. Yes, I said calmly. That's the point. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less defensive, more resigned. You're asking us to formalize your leverage. I'm asking you to formalize the company's stability. Outside my window, Afternoon light had turned honey gold, brushing the buildings with warmth that felt almost ironic. Inside the tower, I imagined the lighting harsher now, less flattering. "We'll revise," he said finally. "No argument, no pride, just movement." When the updated draft arrived, it carried the weight of decision. Appendix A attached, binding amendment language clear, equity allocation confirmed, public correction statement prepared for internal distribution and investor circulation. I read every line twice. Contracts breathe differently when everyone in the room understands them. At 5:11 p.m., another call came, but not from Mark. It was the investor. His voice was measured, curious rather than confrontational. "I understand you authored Section 9. "I did. "And that you've negotiated a resolution." "Yes?" A pause. "Why didn't you simply void the clause and walk away?" The question was sincere. I looked at the skyline, now deepening into early evening blue. "Because the clause wasn't a trap," I said. "It was protection, for the structure." "And for yourself?" "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He hummed softly, almost amused. "Most people in your position would have weaponized the ambiguity. I prefer documentation to drama." A faint chuckle. "Good," he said. "I fund documentation." There it was, the subtle shift. Respect, not spectacle. "I'll require direct confirmation that the amendment is executed before releasing funds," he added. "You'll have it," I replied. When the call ended, I allowed myself one slow breath. Not victory, alignment. At 6:02 p.m., Mark emailed the final executed amendment, signed digitally, time-stamped, attached with the updated NDA and Appendix A. The public correction memo was scheduled for internal release at 8 a.m. the next morning. I read the memo carefully. After internal review, the company acknowledges that the termination of head of licensing was based on misinterpretation of property policy. We are pleased to confirm reinstatement and strategic equity alignment to ensure continuity of proprietary licensing frameworks. Strategic equity alignment. I almost smiled. Yesterday, I had been escorted out with a cardboard box. Today, I was strategic, Daniel texted. "You're trending in the executive chat, in a good way." "I don't need trending," I replied. "I need executed documents." "Those are done," he wrote. "Investor just confirmed receipt." My phone buzzed again seconds later. Short message from Mark. "Funds releasing tomorrow morning." No exclamation point, no apology, just outcome. I stood by the window as city lights flickered on one by one, reflections stacking against the darkening glass. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it edits, sometimes it redlines, sometimes it adds Appendix A. I thought about that thin folder HR had placed in front of me yesterday. The confidence, the certainty, the assumption that access equals ownership. They hadn't been malicious, just careless. Carelessness is expensive when paperwork remembers. At 7:30 p.m., I received one final email. Subject: Board acknowledgement. Brief, formal, clear. The board had approved the amendment unanimously. Unanimously. Power recalibrated quietly again. I closed my laptop slowly, letting the stillness settle. No revenge, no spectacle, no shouting. Just correction. Documented, signed, archived. If you believe this story ends with equity and investor funds, you haven't yet considered what happens when an entire company realizes the quietest person in the room reads every line twice. The internal memo went live at exactly 8 a.m. I didn't need to open it to know how it would land. Corporate emails have a rhythm, subject line first, then a wave of silence, then the private messages. Shock always travels faster than congratulations. Still, I opened it. Clean formatting, neutral tone, no drama, just correction. By 8:07, my phone began to vibrate. Is this real? Congratulations. Wow. The executive chat, once a guarded fortress of polished language, now hummed with something almost human. Uncertainty, respect, cautiously forming. A recalibration of perception. At 8:15, I walked back into the building. No escort this time. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh coffee. The same marble floor, the same security desk, but the air felt different, charged like the moment before a curtain rises. The guard straightened when he saw me. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Good morning," I replied, offering the same calm tone I always had. Upstairs, conversations quieted as I stepped onto the floor. Heads turned, not dramatically, not rudely, just enough. Reputation doesn't shout when it changes. It tilts. My desk stood exactly as I'd left it, the notebook with its colored tabs, the small framed quote, "Paper remembers." I placed my bag down slowly, deliberately. Across the room, HR emerged from her office. She hesitated for half a second before walking toward me. "I wanted to say," she began, voice measured, "that the situation escalated faster than expected." "That tends to happen with conditional clauses," I said gently. A faint flush colored her cheeks. "We've updated internal review protocols." "I'm glad." The conversation ended there, not hostile, not warm, just adjusted. By 9 a.m., the investor funds had officially cleared. An internal notification confirmed it. Capital secured, expansion timeline intact. Applause broke out in one corner of the office. The CEO stepped out of the conference room shortly after, eyes scanning the floor until they found me. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. We met again in that same conference room, the beige walls, the framed mission statement about integrity. Only now, the chairs felt rearranged, even if they physically weren't. He closed the door behind us. "The board appreciates your professionalism," he said. Professionalism. Yesterday, I was a liability. Today, I was an asset. "I appreciate the correction," I replied. He nodded once. "We're revising how we approach intellectual ownership." "That's wise." A small smile flickered across his face. Not forced this time. Thoughtful. "You could have made this far more difficult." "I didn't need to," I said. The document spoke clearly. He studied me for a moment, perhaps recalculating something intangible. Risk, loyalty, value. "We'd like you to lead the next licensing expansion phase," he added. There it was. The final shift, not reinstatement, leadership. "I'll review the proposal," I said evenly. Outside the glass walls, work resumed, keyboards tapped, phones rang. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. People now read more carefully. Legal was looped in earlier. Templates were reviewed twice. Section 9 became a quiet legend. Around noon, Daniel stopped by my desk. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "no one's calling it a mistake anymore." "Oh?" "They're calling it a masterclass." I smiled faintly. "It wasn't a lesson," I said. "It was a contract." He laughed softly and walked away. As the afternoon light stretched long shadows across the floor, I opened the amended NDA one more time. Appendix A sat firmly attached. Equity allocation confirmed. Rights perpetual and documented. Not because I fought loudly, not because I exposed anyone, but because I read carefully and refused to panic when others didn't. The office buzzed on around me, unaware of how close it had come to unraveling, how thin the line is between confidence and oversight. I glanced at the framed quote beside my monitor. Paper remembers. And sometimes, when you let it speak, that's enough. The next investor review would look very different. But this time, no one would underestimate the rights holder. Not again.